Hello, welcome to the endgame of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. We are down to our last 33 or 34 books from the target line. We are currently in 1988, and the line will eventually peter out in the early to mid 1990s. We are at book number 127 today, well, the second, book number 127, which happens to be the first of the 12 Sylvester McCoy novelizations. The books will go on with the McCoy years, the remaining William Hartnell and Patrick Troughton novelizations, and a couple of other surprises along the way, most notably the 3 novelizations of missing stories from the original Season 23, none of which were ever rehearsed, recorded, edited, and released on television. For the Sylvester McCoy years, we are going to reformat the show. Every one of my Sylvester McCoy episodes will have 2 guests instead of 1. Our YouTube channel is now being run by Jim Sangster, who as of this episode is the official co-host of Doctor Who Literature. My voice will be primarily the one you hear in each episode. Jim is going to have a much larger role behind the scenes. He has recorded musical parodies or compositions for most of the remaining episodes of this show, and he will also be releasing videos on YouTube as each new episode comes out in podcast form. I will also have the occasional Doctor Who Literature Presents episodes coming out. I have a couple in the works right now. So the life of this podcast is probably going to take the better part of a year into the middle of 2025. Jim is doing remarkable work behind the scenes on YouTube. I would encourage you to check out and subscribe on YouTube at Doctor Who Novels, Dr. Who Novels, if you have not done so already. This will remain an audio-only podcast, but Jim is doing animated videos for all of his songs, so there are benefits to listening to the podcast on your streamer of choice and watching on YouTube as well. What you might not know is that Doctor Who Literature is my second attempt at a Doctor Who podcast. In the summer of 2021, I originally had the format for a debate show, every episode an hour long, taking another fan and debating some frivolous issue of Doctor Who with them. I recorded 6 episodes with 4 different guests. I did not know much about podcast editing or recording, so I was recording the audio through my computer, resulting in a rather grievous mismatch between the strength of my voice and the quality of my guest's voice. I have never released or formally edited those episodes, and I really don't have any plans to do so, but one of the episodes, recorded on July 20th, 2021, was an hour-long conversation with Joe Ford of the Hamsterverse of Doctor Who podcasts about this week's show, Time and the Rani. My first guest this week will be Jim Sangster. My second guest, after my audio essay, will be an archival interview with Joe Ford. It will not be the full hour that we spoke about on July 2021 on a summer afternoon. It is a heavily edited excerpt down strictly to a monologue. I've turned it into a 19-minute Joe Ford monologue extolling the virtues of Time and the Rani, a story that he enjoys on a much different level than I do. You may occasionally hear me laughing, but for the most part, I have restored that to a 19-minute Joe Ford monologue at the end of this hour that is definitely well worth checking out. Joe has been on Doctor Who Literature before. My first bonus episode talking about the passing of Linda Barron 3 years ago, but here is Joe talking about Time and the Rani. That is probably not something that you will want to miss. So now, starting with Jim Sangster's Time and the Rani song, let's get to it.
Leave the girl, I'm the man you want. Leave the girl, leave the girl, leave the girl, I'm the man you want. Leave the girl, leave the girl, leave the girl, I'm the man you want. Leave the girl, leave the girl, leave the girl, I'm the man you want. You're working in a laboratory, it's where you would usually hide. A brain that no surprise. Leave the girl, I'm the man you want. Leave the girl, I'm the man you want. Leave the girl, I'm the man you want. Leave the girl, leave the girl, leave the girl, I'm the man you want. Leave the girl, I'm the man you want. Leave the girl, leave the girl, I'm the man you want. Leave the girl, I'm the man you want.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Hello, and welcome to Doctor Who Literature, your weekly podcast covering the Target novelizations in publication order. My name is Jason. Joining me, as always, is my co-host, Jim Sangster. How are you, Jim Sangster?
I'm very splendid. It's good to see you.
Given the amount of times that I am just borrowing directly from the 250 podcast without attribution, I am sure that I'm going to get a cease and desist letter from Darren Mooney any day now, but his intro is so good, I had to pay homage to it at least once.
We can carry on copping it by if I interrupt you every time you try and say something, because I've noticed between the Darren and his co-host, they kind of talk over each other a lot. So
when I was recording off Zencaster and I was getting two separate audio tracks, I was able to get rid of all the overtalks, and I was able to make every episode sound studio bound, accounting for the limitations in my headset. But now that Zencaster charges and this is a free show and I'm using Skype, I really don't have that option. I will occasionally re-record if the overtalk is egregious, and I'll do a cursory edit on Audacity before I upload. But yeah, now the overtalks are just a part of life.
which is quite good, because this is a story that we're talking about today where there is a character who overtalks with all the multiple voices in its head. So maybe that's appropriate.
When did you first see Time and the Rani? Because I can tell you exactly when I saw it. And this was part of my show 2 weeks ago when I was doing my essay on the Time Meddler. I first saw Time and the Rani when it had a special PBS airing in New York on March 26th, 1988. And I remember this because it was one of my parents' birthdays, and we had been in Manhattan for a big family gathering. And I was terrified that we were not going to get back to Long Island in time to see Time and the Rani when it started airing at 8 o'clock or whenever it was. And within 20 minutes, I realized that, and the phrase hadn't been invented yet, but for me, this was my jump the shark moment. This is when I knew that Doctor Who was dead. Hashtag RIP Doctor Who, and never coming back. And within 45 minutes, I had given up on watching the show, and I was just organizing my baseball cards, and I turned off the TV before ever reaching the end. So Time and the Rani is one of a few different moments where my Doctor Who fandom was almost broken irrevocably. For you, obviously, you would have, I assume, been watching this in September 1987. So what was it like for you watching this as it came out? And were you going in cold, ice cold, like I was?
Right. This needs a little bit of a run-up. Last time we spoke, we were talking about the Trial of a Time Lord and the Vervoids. And I said that this was a point when I finally started having those sort of fan panics of like, I'm not enjoying this. And I'd come through the Merseyside local group's infamous slagging off of the TV show on a live discussion with Pip and Jane Baker in the room. And then in the intervening year, we found out that the next Doctor was going to be Sylvester. Well, we found out that Colin Baker had been sacked, which was horrific, because it was another, like, we'd already been told the show was getting taken off the air because it was unpopular. Then Colin was sacked, but then J&T was staying. And then it seemed an act of spite that he cast Sylvester McCoy.
Gonna crack my knuckles and jump for joy. I got a clean bill of health from Dr. McCoy.
The night that we found out that Sylvester McCoy was going to be the Doctor, our hearts collectively sank. We were all so fed up. And then we had a visit to the group by Gary Russell, who said he'd seen test footage of the title sequence, and he tried to describe it. And he said these stars appear on one side of the screen, and they blast into the middle of the screen, and then he describes pretty much what we get in the title sequence. And it sounded quite exciting. He certainly sounded enthused. And then we started seeing our first clips, like the trailer would start playing out a few weeks before the show was coming back. Sylvester McCoy was doing the tours on the children's TV shows. And then I saw it live. I saw it go out on the evening. And my first thought was the title sequence was stunningly beautiful. I mean, Doctor Who has always been weird, but it never really went arty. That was quite an artistic, with a narrative. There was a through, and it was three-dimensional. It was going in all dimensions, and it looked beautiful. The music sounded really exciting. And then you have the first half of the episode where Sylvester is kind of playing Colin, and it doesn't work. And it was a bit cringy. He was falling over, and my heart was sinking a bit. By the end of the story, I was a Sylvester McCoy fan. Having gone through the year of Trial of a Time Lord, having gone through the whole period where I'd stopped loving Doctor Who because I felt everyone else had as well. Suddenly, my show was fun again. It felt like I remembered the sort of the Tom Baker era, the early Tom Baker era with Sarah Jane, where they're having adventures and they're having fun. And then we get the rest of season 24, which, to my mind, I love Time in the Rani. But season 24 just gets better and better as it goes, with different ideas, a fresh approach. And this story is kind of a goodbye to the old Who, because this is the last time we get classic writers, well, people who've written for the show in a previous season. We've got a brand new director, we've got brand new music. Everything feels fresh and new. And this is the beginning of the last great hurrah for Doctor Who.
I will say for me, even though I had that crisis of faith in March 1988, and even though I did not watch the full episode at the time that it was aired, my PBS station had managed to obtain that title sequence. And they probably showed it to us during a pledge break. PBS did their pledge breaks 3 times a year. I want to say February was one of the annual pledge breaks. So for a couple of weeks, they would always break into the shows and have the hosts in studio asking you to give money for Doctor Who, give money for Doctor Who, give money for Doctor Who. So they showed the pre-title sequence and the new opening credits at some point in early 1988 or maybe very late 1987. So I didn't have Gary Russell in my fan group because I didn't have a fan group explaining it to me, but I actually did see it, and I was very excited by it, and that's another reason why the episode was so disappointing. But the paperback comes out in May 1988, and I would have bought the paperback as it came out. So I am recording this interview about 2 weeks before the episode goes out. I'm going to be out of town each of the next 2 weekends after this, and Doctor Who it goes out on Sunday morning. So I have to pre-record these episodes, put them on Spotify, and pre-schedule their release. So I am recording basically 3 episodes in a 5-day stretch. So I have in front of me all 3 books that I'm recording. I have book 126, The Time Meddler. I have book 127, The Mysterious Planet. And I have book 127, Time in the Rani, which is incredibly confusing, by the way. The Time in the Rani being the first book to have the new McCoy logo and the last book to have a photographic cover, the upside-down tetraps. This is not quite as naughty as the cover to Terror of the Vervoids, as we discussed last time you were on here. And I didn't have the same amount of objections in the house as I did when I left the Vervoids book face up in a public area. But this is not a great cover until I realized the tetraps are upside down. So when I looked at the cover like this, upside down, it actually was much more interesting visually. Not a good cover, though. When I got to the portions of the book where the brains are arguing with the Doctor, I was doubled over in laughter. And I thought that was the best scene, the funniest scene in Doctor Who that I'd seen in years. Years being a relative term because I'd only been a fan for 3.5 years at that point. And then when I finally watched the episode again, when it came on PBS, when they finally showed all of season 24, that would have been the end of 88 or beginning of 89, I found that scene disappointing because the voices were all, audio, they were all treated and they all sounded the same. And in my head, it was much funnier in the book. But the book probably rescued my fandom from the dark pit of despair that my initial viewing of the TV episode had put it into.
I've got a version of that pop hit. Last night the bakers saved my life. That's the thing I love about Time the Rani is I remember explaining to an older fan who pretty much hated everything that happened after 1969, and saying how much I loved the new Doctor because of the malapropisms and all the silly phrases he has. And it just felt that, and also the fact that Pip and Jane are still the people who've written for Mel the most. But they always tried to give us something to do. Although hindsight is a wonderful thing, because I only realized this week the Tetraps are bats and Mel screams, and surely they could have worked in some way of making Mel scream, give her a bit of a superpower against bats with sensitive hearing. Maybe that would have been a great thing, but we know for a fact that they were writing up against a deadline. In fact, we were just talking before we started recording. I was trying to piece together everything that had happened. I remember an interview with Pip and Jane Baker. I don't know which magazine it was in. It wasn't Doctor Who magazine, where they said that they'd been caught out with the Vervoid story. They'd have to write it quite quickly because all of the other scripts had fallen through, and they wrote theirs, I think, like a script a week. So they started working on a new idea revolving around a giant brain. Then, in quick succession, Colin Baker is sacked. J&T is told he's not moving on to another show. He's lost his script editor. He's lost his will to live. And he's also booked to do his Christmas panto. And ever to have the wrong sort of priorities. He thinks, I've got to focus on this panto, but I've also got to get someone to help me out here. So he's able to somehow get Pip and Jane Baker writing. And they've already got an idea. And he says, we'll see if we can get Colin back to do the first story. So, they're writing Colin Baker. Then they find out Colin won't come back because, as he rightly points out, at the time when they have to be doing this sort of goodbye episode, he'll need to be looking for regular work. So, it's often written up, Colin Baker refused to come back. No, Colin Baker was in a position where he couldn't come back. They'd sacked him, so why would he come back?
Right.
So I think it's great the way that Pip and Jane Baker quickly adapt to writing for a new Doctor, and they've gone, okay, we had the last one being very loquacious and pompous, make this one funny and silly. So they give him the malapropisms, and that's a nice little thing that, a bit like Troughton with his hat, quickly falls by the wayside. But it's at least they've got a new way of doing the Doctor, and they're writing this very, very quickly over Christmas 1986. At some point, J&T gets a script editor in the form of Andrew Cartmel, who has very clear ideas of what he thinks Doctor Who isn't. And Pip and Jane Baker kind of represent that. So there's not much he can do with this one. Just guide it home and make sure it's producible. But at least with Pip and Jane, they tended to write things that could be made and could be produced. So once again, they saved the show.
Some interesting perspectives here. This, of course, is a publication order podcast, and Tony Witt's The Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast is a story order podcast. In story order, this is the third of 3 consecutive books by Pip and Jane Baker. Given their rather idiosyncratic prose style, if you are trying to read the books in story order, those 3 books in a row are probably a pretty large hurdle to clear. However, what it means is that Mel was in Doctor Who during her first turn on the show before RTD. She was on the show for 20 weeks. The first 10 of those 20 weeks are all written by Pip and Jane Baker. The 4 episodes of Vervoids and the 2 episodes of Ultimate Foe, or if you will, parts 9 through 14 of Trial of a Time Lord. And then parts 1 through 4 of Time and the Rani. So that's 10 straight stories, and then Mel is only in 10 more episodes after that. The 4 episodes of Paradise Towers, the 3 episodes of Delta and the Bannerman, 3 episodes of Dragonfire. So half of the words that Bonnie Langford utters on this show before RTD are written by Pip and Jane Baker. Ultimate Foe airs in December 1986. I don't know exactly when the BBC told Colin Baker that he had been sacked, but I do have sitting across from me Andrew Cartmel's production diary, Script Doctor, which I assume most listeners to this show already have it and have read it. If not, definitely go ahead and order it. He was, 24 years old when he's hired as script editor, basically de facto showrunner of Doctor Who, and he's putting his half of season 24 together on no notice. Time and the Rani he inherited. The other 3 stories he is responsible for varying degrees. But with JNT being kept on a show he didn't want to be on anymore, and with Andrew Cartmel being onboarded after season 24 has already begun, and with not that much time between the airing of Ultimate Foe and the cameras rolling on Time and the Rani, you have to assume that all of this happened within a 90-day stretch between Colin being fired, Cartmel being hired, and Time and the Rani being committed to videotape. Which
kind of sudden, yeah, because there's a bit of an overlap, because the point when the BBC confirm that Colin's been sacked is about a week after a tabloid's already leaked it, which means Colin appeared on a Saturday morning children's TV show called Saturday Superstore, right at the end of Trial of a Time Lord, and he's there in full beard, so he looks. Actually, has he got a beard for that? Whatever. There's a question from a child saying, if you could travel in time, where would you go? And his answer is so telling. I'd go right back to the start and do it all over again.
Oh,
and
wow.
it's heartbreaking. We watched that at the time, and I'm actually, weirdly, I met up with that gang, including Chris Chibnall and Daniel Adams, that afternoon, and we all said, he's been sacked, hasn't he? We knew, because we'd seen the tabloids rumoring, and we knew that he knew he'd been sacked. It was such a telling thing. It was heartbreaking. Even though I'd not enjoyed most of his era, I didn't want him to go. I wanted him to get better. And I didn't want Sylvester McCoy. But as soon as Time of the Rani starts, I completely forget my loyalty. And I am 100% a McCoy fan right to the end.
This is similar to my experience in watching Casino Royale in the theaters in December 2006. I went in very possessive of Pierce Brosnan. And then within 15 minutes of Daniel Craig, I was, Pierce who?
Mm.
And
I love the fact that in that one, they get all the tropes of what a Bond film is. And it's like they throw them all up in the air, and whichever order they land on the floor is when they happen in the movie. So you don't get the shaken, not stirred until quite late on. And it's thrown away. You don't get a title sequence until the end of the film.
Right.
So, and it feels a bit like that with not just, Time of the Rani, as I said, it's a bit of a legacy act, because you've just got Pip and Jane Baker writing a story of a mad Time Lord with a ridiculous experiment, writing a regeneration story where the Doctor doesn't quite know who he is. We've had doppelganger stories. We've had brains hooked up to machines. We've had a lot of these things before. But this feels a little bit like a greatest hits in its best way, because they are a safe pair of hands to write something that can be produced. And then next month, Andrew Cartmel is going to get the first of these new writers. Another thing to think of, by the way, is JNT's budget was kept the same year on year when inflation was rising. So he looks at his budget for this year. It's the same as the budget for last year, and he realizes something quite drastic. He can't afford anybody with experience. The way that I think all jobs in TV, but let's just focus on the BBC because I've seen the paperwork and I know this is what happens. If you work for the BBC, the next time you work for them, your agent will negotiate for the same fee as last time plus X%. So if you've got any experienced writer, someone who's written for Doctor Who before, and bearing in mind JNT was always a little bit reluctant to get people who'd written for Doctor Who before, not just because they might know more about it than he did, or because they have a way of doing things that he no longer does, but also they come with their original fee plus any number of X% on top. Whereas he starts giving all these new writers a brand new start, their first big break in TV, because they're cheap. He gets all these directors who are straight off the director's course because they're cheap. And it just happens that because they're enthusiastic, they haven't been ground down by the system like he has. They're all trying their best. They're all trying to do something innovative and different. Whereas the reason why Andrew Cartmel gets so much support from J&T is quite obvious in Andrew Cartmel's diaries, because J&T, the only thing he ever says to him is, "I've learned from experience you won't get this past the BBC." So the easiest route is to just avoid doing that. And that's his guiding hand all the way through. He's given up. He just wants an easy life. He doesn't want to be challenged. Andrew Cartmel wants to bring down the government. So he's really challenging. But you've got this fresh young lad coming in, and you've got this old hand, and it's like innocence and experience working together to create something that is magical. But a lot of fans who go, "Oh, I love the McCoy era except Time and Rani." No, for me, it's all in. My except comes in the next series, and it involves a certain silver nemesis.
I have 2 points to make. Well, one is a point and one is a question. And just to preface that, I have a guest lined up for Silver Nemesis, for whom Silver Nemesis is perhaps the greatest Doctor Who story of all time in an unironic sense.
Excellent.
I don't have.
It deserves a champion because it's episode 1's great, and a lot of the things that are wrong about it are because of production problems. But
I don't have you booked for my Silver Nemesis episode, so I will not hear your voice on that. I may give you a chance during this recording to trash it further, but
no, that's enough. It's every story deserves a champion except Rings of Akaten. So no, even that. Every story deserves a champion.
So my 2 points. Again, 1 point, 1 question. Point number 1. It is not unusual for a new Doctor to have the beginning of his era be a hangover from the previous era. This is why Patrick Troughton's first story is ghost written by Dennis Spooner, and why it features the Daleks. You have to have that continuity. I see you furrowing your brow. Written by David Whittaker, but I believe Dennis Spooner took Whittaker's overlong scripts and condensed it into the 6 episodes that we ended up getting. Again, very heavy Hartnell hangover. There is no hangover between season 6 and 7. It is a fresh start, even though it's the same producer, Derek Sherwin, because now it's in color. None of the cast have come back. The only hangover is the Brigadier, but he sticks around for the rest of the era.
Well, the hangover there is basically the invasion, isn't it? It's Derek Sherwin going, "We're going to make the invasion again." And you've got Terence Dix, who's finally being paid to do the job he's been doing for a year.
Right.
But the hangover is, we've made all the decisions, now you go and make it, Barry Letts. And that's a little bit like the situation that Andrew Cartmel's finding himself in here. It's we've had to hit the ground running. You've got to catch up. I've already commissioned the first story. Here it is. Now go and commission 3 more.
Similarly, Barry Letts does the first story of the Tom Baker era contemporaneous to Planet of the Spiders, which is why the Brigadier is only in the beginning and end of Planet of the Spiders, because he was busy making Robot at the same time. So Tom Baker's era begins with this very heavy unit story, and then unit is quickly phased out after that. So Robot is almost sui generis. The same way that Deep Breath is a Matt Smith story with Peter Capaldi in it, because you have the Pater Noster gang appearing for the final time, and you have Matt Smith literally phoning in a cameo towards the end of the episode to let all the pre-teen girls who were there solely for Matt Smith know, it's okay, you can like this crusty old man too. And of course, those pre-teen girls go away and never come back, and that has an effect on not only the ratings, but also convention attendance at Gallifrey 1, which during the Matt Smith era sold out within 45 minutes of convention tickets going on sale, to not selling out nearly that fast. So Time in the Rani is perhaps in keeping with the tradition of the Doctor's first story being the previous Doctor's adventure, and with him wearing his predecessor's costume for the first, 10 or 20 or 30 minutes of story time. My question is, you've talked about how JNT could not afford to bring back old talent, which is why almost all the directors are new, with the exception of Chris Clough, who I gather was not much older than Andrew Cartmel himself. And all the writers are new writers after Time in the Rani, and some of the writers come back, but I would speculate that bringing Ben Aronovich for a second script is still much cheaper than bringing Peter Grimwade back for his 5th script, or bringing Robert Holmes back for his 20th. But Robert Holmes had been writing for the show in season 23, and the only reason Robert Holmes didn't write the last week of Trial of a Time Lord is because he died in May 1986. Had Robert Holmes not died, would Robert Holmes have been commissioned to write Ask's story somewhere during seasons 24, 25, or 26?
No, because Andrew Cartmel wouldn't have been in the thrall of him and wouldn't have known to ask him, I think. He became aware of a lot of these things later, I suspect. But also, remember, Eric Sayward had to fight to get Robert Holmes on the show. He was fighting for the Five Doctors, and when that didn't work out, he was fighting to give him a consolation prize. And it's only when, J&T had been burnt with Maverick directors, and when he starts hearing these stories of, we got another Maverick director, and everyone hates him, and it's an absolute disaster. But then he sees what Androzani actually looks like, and he goes, "Oh no, this one is not Love at Bickford. This
Or
one
Paul Joyce, for that
is
matter.
not Paul's choice. This one
Yeah.
actually knows what he's doing." And similarly, Chris Clough, he did the previous season, but he's still got a very cheap original fee plus one, because he's only done Doctor Who. And actually, he's doing consecutive seasons, so I don't even know if his plus one will be that great, or plus whatever percentage. So he's still very new, and he's cast because he came top of the season poll the previous year, whereas pretty much everyone else who's working on Trial of a Time Lord had written for the show before. That's right, isn't it? Everyone who wrote for Trial of a Time Lord had written for the show before. Whereas Pip and Jane Baker are the last people to work on Doctor Who, certainly at the front end of the credits, to have worked on the show. And from now on, it's basically, the things like set design and costume and all that, that's just part of the departmental costs. So they're going to cost what it'll cost. But the sort of the temporary hires, like guest cast and things like that, J&T is trying to find the money all over the place. Now, you might say, hold on, he's casting Kate O'Mara. Well, I just said, his priorities are a bit skewed. Kate O'Mara says to him, "I'm coming back to the UK. I'm sick of all the sunshine in LA after doing Dynasty." He quickly realizes, okay, we've got a brand new doctor. Everyone's been really hostile about it. Actually, he hasn't even cast the doctor at this point, has he? They're writing for an unknown doctor. So the first person he pretty much hires is Pip and Jane Baker, and then it's Kate O'Mara, because at least having that recognizable star might help them. I think this is also before he finds out that they're getting bumped from Saturdays to Wednesdays, which is always seen as by the fans as a terrible thing. Actually, it was a brilliant strategic thing. They'd already decided to cut the budget on Doctor Who, so it was below the budget of any grown-up drama, to see if they can kind of squeeze it out. And then they move it into a slot where they don't show dramas in that slot. What they've previously showed is light entertainment and lifestyle shows. But we gave Doctor Who a Saturday night slot, and it bombed. But it bombed in a sort of consistent way where it got 5 million viewers watching all the way through. Why don't we put it in a slot where those 5 million viewers would not normally be watching? And if we put it up against Coronation Street, no show is going to survive against Coronation Street. It's the biggest show in the land. But if we can get 5 million viewers up against Coronation Street when our predecessors are struggling to get 3, that's going to make us look good. And it was a good strategy. It did actually protect Doctor Who, I think, for 3 years, because had J&T not left, had they not had this whole thing of wanting to get rid of staff producers, and it's all leaning towards the privatization of the BBC, which happened in the early 90s. They just didn't announce it, by the way. All programs are made by indies now. All programs are made by people other than the BBC. But you've got this gradual political move. The changes in the BBC are already kind of happening. Doctor Who looks very old-fashioned because it's still made on videotape. The special effects are actually catching up with other things, but everything else looks like it's shot like a sitcom. In the following year, when they do a big announcement of the new season on BBC One, and Doctor Who is propped up with a Lower Low, the wartime comedy, and if you look at the video stock, they look very similar. The difference is a Lower Low is celebrated and valued, and Doctor Who is a bit of an embarrassment. But it's an embarrassment that can still command 5 to 6 million viewers midweek when no other show is going to do that.
So let's segue into the Darren Mooney questions. The 250 is not just the top 250 movies of all time as ranked on the Internet Movie Database, but they also have a cycle where they look at the bottom 100, the worst movies of all time. The hosts do have a sort of affinity, not just even for schlock horror, but for badly made films, such as Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, which I thought was a joke that they were talking about before I realized, no, this is an actual film that exists following Winnie the Pooh going into the public domain a couple of years ago. So to that end, looking at the 2014 top to bottom DWM survey, 1 to 241, Time in the Rani is ranked at number 239, the third worst Doctor Who story ever made up until that point. Below it are only Fear Her and The Twin Dilemma. Above it are Time Lash, Time Flight, Underworld. Does Time and the Rani belong on a list of the 3 worst Doctor Who stories ever made, not counting the last 10 years?
Just to reverse my answer from last time, it might be the least successful of this season. But this season is one of my favorites of all time. It's certainly not as bad as the stories from the previous season. It's certainly not as bad as at least one story from the previous season to that. It's not the worst story of the 80s. I was looking at the 2014, yeah, as you say, it came third from bottom. In 2020, it was 284th out of 295, so it beat Twin Dilemma and Fear Her again. It also had, it feels very political when you've got 3 Jodie Whittaker stories in the bottom, along with In the Forest of the Night, Time Flight, Underworld, Space Pirates, Time Lash, Dr. Widder and the Wardrobe. But Time in the Rani is below the Dominators. Now, we know your feelings on the Dominators. Sorry, Fraser. It's below Journey to the Center of the TARDIS, a story where they very bravely decide, let's make the entire guest cast non-white. Very commendable. Now let's make them carjackers. You've got the Rings of Akaten. And in the 2020 survey, Silver Nemesis comes in at 250. Now, there is no way Silver Nemesis, as enjoyable as it can be, is objectively better than Time in the Rani. It just isn't. It's all tease and no payoff. But I'm not going to be mad. I'm not insane. Time in the Rani is a very solid 6 out of 10.
So I would.
But that means that it's got to be in the top 60th, percentile. It doesn't deserve to be at the very bottom.
So if I were to ask you, is Time in the Rani on your own personal list of the 3 worst Doctor Who stories ever made? I assume the answer is a resounding no.
It's absolutely not. It's absolutely not. I'm actually curious now. I know that the Twin Dilemma is very easy to put on the bottom of the list. Where did I put my Who preference? Nothing sexier than someone looking something. So my bottom, let's see. The bottom story of all time for me is The Rings of Akaten. Then The Twin Dilemma, then Time Flight, Underworld, Space Pirates, Vampires of Venice. I've included The Infinite Quest. That's a cheat.
See, I don't have the 2020 DWM survey accessible because I don't think I have. If I have that issue of the magazine, it's buried in a box in the other room, and it's not available online the way the 2014 survey is. Now, again, with review bombing and with a certain vocal and entitled section of fandom trying to declare that Doctor Who is dead because of Jodie and Ncuti Gatwa, obviously the results are skewed based on which entitled fans have access to the internet. Objectively, Journey to the Center of the TARDIS is one of the worst bits of television that I've ever seen. Rings of Akaten, I just have no patience for. I don't think that there are any Jodie stories that I would put in my bottom 10. I think the Battle of Rumpelstiltskin, which I will say for lack of never remembering the name, is probably the weakest story that serves as a season finale, but it is immediately redeemed by Resolution coming along a few weeks later. For me, Time in the Rani is almost certainly in my bottom 10 or bottom 20, but I do not hate it with the passion that I did in 1988. I'm much more accepting of it now. Now, speaking of nothing more dangerous than a fan with an opinion, you were holding up DWB, which was the infamous anti-JNT fanzine from the late 1980s.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it says 1989, right? The front cover, the cover date is yellow on a white background. That's how professional this is. And it's Doctor Who series survey results. Now, obviously, this magazine skews very closely to pre-JNT. So the bottom, you're not going to like this. So the very bottom story is the Twin Dilemma. Second is Time in the Rani. Third is Time Lash. Fourth is Paradise Towers. They're insane. Fifth is The Horns of Nymont. Sixth is Gunfighters. Then Delta and the Bannermen, Happiness Patrol, Time Flight, Warriors of the Deep. That's the bottom 10. Again, it's a very biased survey. I think objectively, any worst stories of the classic series that doesn't include Underworld is deluding itself. But I think that the backlash there is people having a go at JNT, having a go at Sylvester McCoy, having a go at the BBC, and kind of picking the wrong targets. Because even if you don't like Time in the Rani, there's so much that is admirable. The special effects are gorgeous. Although you can say that about Underworld, it's the only decent thing about it. Kate O'Mara is pitching it absolutely in the right direction. There's a gorgeous cast in this. There's loads of familiar faces. Like we've got Wanda Ventham, who was in Faceless Ones and Image of the Fendal. You've got Donald Pickering, who was also in the Faceless Ones. He was in Keys of Marinus, which was the first book that me and you talked about all those years ago. And he's also
his co-star in Keys of Marinus, I should say, to interrupt you, was Fiona Walker, who we will be seeing on Doctor Who again in season 25.
Yes, we will.
In a story that you have no particular fondness for.
She's great in it, though. Also, Donald Pickering is another person we can tick off from the cast of The Pallisers, in which he plays this very camp, gossipy old grandee who basically introduces the entire family to us, the audience, by saying, "Oh, look over there, that's Lady Whatnot and that's Lord whatever," and he's a lovely performance. We've also got Mark Greenstreet, who the previous year had starred as Brat Farah in Terrance Dicks's production of that book. And Mark Greenstreet is a kind of very pretty post-new romantic kind of actor. He was very briefly hot at this point here. So it's a really good coup for JNT to cast. But then the costume designers put them in those ridiculous fright wigs and all those very vivid colours, which does make it look very silly. But then you've got the Tetraps. Now, I think the Tetraps are one of the last great monsters in Doctor Who. They were so good they got their own action figure from the Dapol collection. And the way that it's directed, when we see Urak and we see like a hand or a foot or a little bit of an ear or a little bit of an eye or whatever, the build-up is beautiful. I just want to add one little thing though about the name Tetrap. Again, I've got to be very careful here because I'll admit I was told this, but I've never seen it verified anywhere else. Apparently, the original name for the Tetraps was a more unwieldy Tetrapriapus, because their idea originally was that they would have 4 stalks. Their eyes would be on 4 stalks on the head, until somebody pointed out that the word priapic has another meaning.
Yes.
And so they shortened it to Tetraps. And I think that the planet name is a corruption of that word, but it's not quite the 4 priapic things that they were originally aiming for.
And for those of you who have a copy of Tabor's Cyclopedic Medical Dictionary on your reference shelf behind you, look up the word priapism. That is not a suitable topic for discussion on a family show, but those of you who have access to the internet may look it up at your own convenience and peril.
And we pride ourselves on being a family show, don't we, really?
Yes.
Yeah. despite my best efforts.
And mine.
But yeah, I've lost my thread there.
So we've talked about how Time in the Rani is maligned by fandom at large, at least in the 2014 survey that I have access to. And I certainly, in 1988, thought this was the worst thing ever, and it nearly destroyed my fandom in the show. Clearly, it didn't, because here I am on a weekly podcast talking about it in year 3 of a weekly podcast. I have come to terms with the story. My next guest after you on this same episode, by the way, this is a reformatting of Doctor Who literature. I will have 2 guests for each of these Sylvester McCoy stories. My next guest includes Time and the Rani as one of their favorite stories of all time, and in an unironic sense, and we'll address some of the points that you made. But my point is, I don't think this story belongs in the bottom 3, especially over the last 10 years when we have things like In the Forest of the Night, the story that says going off your psychiatric medications is the best thing you can do for yourself, which I do not recommend. And, of course, Journey to the Center of the TARDIS. And for me, if I ever have to rank Doctor Who top to bottom, Space Babies will be at the bottom of the list. That is not a coded political dig against Ncuti Gatwa. That is the style of humor in Space Babies is my least favorite style of humor of all time, bodily function humor, and I can tell you for a fact I will never watch that story again, even though it has much to praise in it, such as the sharp political commentary about the horrible anti-immigration movement, which in the United States is wreaking havoc right now in a place called Springfield, Ohio. So for me, Space Babies will always be the worst Doctor Who story of all time because I will never watch it again, even though it has much to recommend it. I think Time in the Rani is middle of the pack at worst.
As I said, I'm a little bit more generous on it. I would put it a 6 out of 10, so in the 60% area, which I think is fair. But not every story needs to be in the top 10 because only 10 of them can, and especially if you're counting the modern era as well. I mean, I know a lot of people are very insistent, it's all one show, and that's why we have all these lists that merge everything together. I do separate them out because I think that they're 2 completely different production styles. They've got different generations of audience, and I think even if I just said the top classic stories, I don't think Time in the Rani would get into the top 60, but it would be in the top half for me.
It is not in my top 60, but it's interesting when you read out the DWB poll of the bottom 10, 2 of those DWB bottom 10 stories are in my top 60. The Gunfighters, for which you were my guest back in episodes 101A and B, and also Paradise Towers, which for me was a bottom 3 Doctor Who story when I first started ranking all the stories in my copy of the Loftier Program Guide 2nd edition in 1990. It was one of 3 stories that I ranked as the worst of all time, next to Power of Kroll and Greatest Show in the Galaxy, all of which I have evolved on significantly now that I'm not 60. If folks could see how far your jaw dropped when I told you that I hated Greatest Show in the Galaxy 34 years ago. That is a picture, my friend. I have come around on all those stories. But yeah, in 1990, when I was 16 going on 17.
Fellows will fall in line.
But the point is, bottom 10 is subjective. And what is bottom 10 now in the 2020s is very largely political based on what certain sectors of fandom think about diversity, equity, and inclusion in Doctor Who. For me, a bottom 10 story is a story that I actively loathe and never want to watch again. I think should never have been commissioned in the first place. Time in the Rani, I think, is a story that benefits a lot once you understand what is going on behind the scenes, which you have ably described for us. Once you realize how Time in the Rani was made, that makes it a stealth top 10 story. There is absolutely no universe in which this should work because of the production and the script editing and the casting and the writing and what now appears to be the primitive CGI effects. This story should not have been made. It should not have succeeded at all. The fact that it does exist and is available on Blu-ray and is available in a novelization that turned my opinion around on the story and is legitimately celebrated by certain segments of fandom, two of whom appear in this episode. The fact that you can get a good story out of what was going on behind the scenes is a miracle.
And also, just from the very beginning, as soon as it starts, we've got the CGI, which at the time it looked great. It looked very glitzy and lovely. But from the very beginning, you've got something else that's new. We've got a pre-title sequence,
right?
Which is very rare. And then we've got the opening music, the opening theme music, which is maybe an acquired taste, but I really like it. But then you get the incidental music, and I don't think Kev McCulloch quite goes the distance, but in his first season, he delivers 3 really exciting scores. The song that we have to introduce this, it's actually an original song. It's not even a pastiche like I normally do, but it was very much inspired by those orchestral stabs that you get in all those songs in the mid to late 1980s. And all of a sudden, Doctor Who sounds like New Order and the Pet Shop Boys and hip hop, and it just sounds really exciting. It's we've got rid of Malcolm Clark and the Radiophonic Workshop for good. Even though I was a big fan of the Radiophonic Workshop, I wasn't so much of a fan of Malcolm Clark. And we've got another thing, which is it's cheaper to do the music with young indies, independent music makers. We'll get Dominic Glynn back, but in this season, it's 3 stories done by Kev McCulloch, and all 3 of them have got a different style. And I think he's just so exciting. So my song for this episode is kind of a tribute to him.
And as always, Jim, I thank you for your being a producer on this show and for adding your musical touches and your informed commentary. I could not do this show without you, and as I look at the upcoming schedule, I don't have you down for any of the next 30 books, which is shocking. So let's remedy that after the break. I am going to be segueing into my second interview and my review of the novelization, looking at my email, because I used to type up my reviews of the novelizations and send them as emails to Stacey Smith, who runs the ratings guide. The date stamp on my review of Time and the Rani, which I drafted but never finished and never sent, is dated March 16th, 2020, which was a Monday. It was my last day in the office. We were sent home halfway through the day because of the COVID pandemic, and I did not set foot in the office again for another 27 months. My review of the novel is, I've decided that I'm going to just read it out as is, because it is an artifact in time as to what headspace I was in on March 16, 2020, when I was doing a story order reread of the Targets, which was scuttled by the pandemic, because I basically stopped reading for several months. And then when I resumed 18 months later, it was in publication order for this podcast. It is a negative and it is a harsh review, and it does not reflect what I think about Time and the Rani today, especially after hearing your spin on things. But I am going to leave that in as an artifact in time as to what was in Jason's head the day of the COVID pandemic, turning me into a permanent work-at-home worker. And this is about 9 days before I started showing my first COVID-19 symptoms, which was one of the worst experiences of my life. So the following review of Time and the Rani, the novelization, is much harsher than our discussion, and of course the following interview after that. But I think it's an important historical artifact, so let's do that after the break. Jim, thank you once again for being here.
I'll just say, to paraphrase Sylvester McCoy's last line of the story, it'll grow on you, Jason. It'll grow on you.
They all say, who is Doctor Who?
This is Tim Treloar.
This is David J. Howe.
I'm Peter Purvis.
I am Sadie Miller. This is Lauren Cornelius.
Larry, it's Fraser.
For all things in the Doctor Who collecting world and beyond, the Doctor Who Collectors Podcast. I'm Larry Van Mersbergen, your host, and I've been collecting for 42 years. You're listening to Doctor Who Literature on the Direction Point Podcast Network. Keep turning the pages.
Doctor Who, Time and the Rani, by Pip and Jane Baker, televised as Time and the Rani, by Pip and Jane Baker. Televised in September 1987. Paperback release date May 5th, 1988. Target book number 127. Yes, that's 2 book 127s in a row. Assailed by violent bolts of multicolored energy, the TARDIS is blasted off course and forced to land on the barren planet of Lakersha. The turbulence brings about the Doctor's 6th regeneration. But that is the least of his worries. He has been hijacked by that ruthless renegade time lady, the Rani. Why has the Rani brought the Doctor to Lakersha? What are the hideous Tetrap guards? Who are the 11 geniuses she has imprisoned in her stronghold? What is the vital significance of the asteroid's strange matter? And can the Doctor stop the Rani's diabolical scheme before it affects the whole of creation throughout time and space? Quick, what are the 6th Doctor's last words? If you said carrot juice, carrot juice, carrot juice, you'd be wrong. They're actually, take a look at the computer readout screen. Come to find out, Pip and Jane Baker actually include the 6th Doctor's regeneration in the Time and the Rani book, assigning him final dialogue and explaining directly that he died due to banging his head against, quote, the plinth of the console. Alas, the final moments of Colin Baker in the book are pedestrian. No last-minute flourishes of archaic verbiage or verbose pronouncements or poetic flourishes. No realization, even, that he's about to die. This is an interesting glimpse at the 6th Doctor's final moments, but there could have been more. There is at least a reference to the Hads, see the Crotons, and see, I guess, Wild Blue Yonder, as the TARDIS seeks to escape the tumultuous buffeting caused by the Rani's interference. Again, I'm going to write this review without commenting too much on the Baker's unique writing style. We've already discussed that in our episodes on Mark of the Rani and Terror of the Vervoids. Although the phrase megabyte computer in Chapter 2 seems an intentional dig at their detractors who sit around, stroke their beards, cluck their tongues, and cry, "Megabyte modem!" Now, I may have said this earlier, Time and the Rani Part 1 is dreadful, misconceived television and almost broke my fandom, but the Bakers in print, bless them, really take pains to explain and rationalize that whole painful mess. We get a real explanation for the 7th Doctor's 2 unfunny comedic pratfalls, one because he's in a confused regenerative state, still thought he was 6 feet tall, rather than Sylvester's 5'6", the other because Colin's costume is now too large and he trips on the excess fabric, not possible on TV where the costume regenerated to fit Sylve's lesser size. In short, Time and the Rani in print is most interesting when it avoids the TV serial. We get, for example, a rare mention of the Doctor's academic past, as the Bakers tell us what subjects both he, thermodynamics, and the Rani, neurochemistry, studied at the Time Lord Academy. I also like learning that the Rani is still on her original first incarnation. Mel acted in The Scottish Play as one of the 3 witches, and internally likens the barren Lakershan surface to a particular blasted heath. Not only that, but without the crutch of Bonnie Langford's remarkable lungs, the authors spend less time having Mel scream, and more time having her think and plan. The book, other than that, is largely a faithful transcription of the rehearsal scripts, stage direction words such as tenebrous, irie, quote, steamy, fetid fug, that's F-U-G, by the way, unquote, and humped, ew, all appear in the prose. The prose also contains some elements dropped for TV, such as Icona holding Mel in a neck yoke in the Part 1 material, that's Chapter 4 in the book. Missing, sadly, is the scripted scene for the Rani's abduction of Albert Einstein from Earth, but we learn the identity of other Earth geniuses captured by the Rani, including Louis Pasteur and Charles Darwin. How much more interesting this book could have been had it contained more unconscious geniuses and fewer conscious Lakershans. Now, not every choice the Bakers make is good. They have a tendency to rely on easy, puerile jokes. Check out how they portray the Tetrabarian language at the end of Chapter 13. Real original, right? Yeah. No. The Doctor is openly speciesist, mentally classifying the Tetraps as a quote-unquote monstrosity in reaction to its appearance, That's the polar opposite of what Doctor Who is usually about. Now, I credit the book for being legit funny where it counts. Chapter 18, The Doctor's Misadventures Inside the Rani's Gestalt Brain, is literally one of the funniest things I'd ever read when I was 14 years old, and it's much better in print than staged on TV. The byplay between Einstein and Niels Bohr is Doctor Who at its best. And I also give the book credit for trying to smooth out the silly stuff, and there is a lot of silly stuff, by explaining the science. Well, trying to. The chapter in which the fictitious substance Loy Hargel is introduced, chapter 20, is titled Holy Grail. Well, that's better than the Tetrabarian language. The Bakers also define some of the concepts used in the text, like the Doctor and Rani debating over biodegradable versus petroleum-based conductors, and what the leptonic era was. We also, as usual for novelizations, which were based on rehearsal or camera scripts and not the televised product, get some interesting extra sequences, such as a tetrap who is supposed to be killed by a Rani-devised instant fungus, which would have been on TV in the Part 4 material, had it been filmed. Time and the Rani is many things on TV. Bad, silly, annoying, a betrayal of the audience. Remember, I wrote the script on March 16th, 2020. I was not in the same headspace I'm at today. But it's also the only Doctor Who story, at least in book form, to reference Elvis and Mrs. Malaprop and Niels Bohr all at once. So the book is a better read than you'd expect from TV. Now that is damning with faint praise, very faint praise, but the book is better.
That was a nice nap. Now, down to business. I'm a bit worried about the temporal flicker in Sector 13. There's a bicentennial refit of the TARDIS to book in. I must just pop over to Centauri 7, and then perhaps a quick holiday. Right, that all seems quite clear. Just 3 small points. Where am I? Who am I? And who are you?
The history of the Topps Company is one of the great American stories, at least until the 21st century. Founded in New York City, out of the remains of American Leaf Tobacco, a family of Jewish immigrants remodeled the company into a bubblegum concern in 1938, probably best known for Bazooka, the gum that came wrapped in tiny little comic strips, Bazooka Joe. Topps diversified and branched out into trading cards, in 1951 entering the baseball card market, which they quickly came to dominate. Now, Topps didn't invent baseball cards, but they did perfect the form. Baseball cards had long served as a product delivery system. Cigarettes originally. Check out the history of Hannes Wagner and the T206 trading card, which is ridiculously valuable if you happen to have one in your attic. But Topps would have artistic photos, often airbrushed, on the front of the card, and meticulous statistics on the back, also livened up with biographical details of each player: height, weight, place of birth, place of residence, how their current team acquired them, with trivia highlighting memorable games, and sometimes cartoons and quizzes. The 1983 Topps Luis Aguayo card, which is worth in the mid-double digits, and I have one, not nearly as valuable as the T206 Hannes Wagner, has on the back the summary of the very first baseball game I ever attended, April 15th, 1982, at Shea Stadium in Queens, New York, where the estimable Mr. Aguayo crushed the Mets' hopes, and mine, at age 8. I got into Topps cards in the late 70s and early 80s. Back then, boys would bring their cards to school and trade them. In the first grade, my classmate Anthony kept talking about Mike Schmidt, the Philadelphia Phillies third baseman, who later wound up in the Baseball Hall of Fame. And I thought I knew that word, because my parents used it a lot. Schmidt, Schmidt, Schmidt. And I dutifully reported to the teacher that Anthony was cursing. He wasn't, of course. My parents used a similar but different S word. Now, my father's idea of a different college fund for me was to collect the complete Topps sets for the years 1977 through 1979 and save them for me in shoeboxes. Topps put out 726 cards a year, and later 792, and that amount fits neatly into a standard shoebox end to end. Now, you couldn't buy factory sets back then, you could later, so my father assembled his late 70s sets card by card through trades with his New York City public school students in Prospect Heights, Brooklyn, and he'd give me the duplicates to play with. Now, the duplicates I'd shove in my pocket and bring them to school and trade them. They are called trading cards for a reason. My father stopped collecting for me in 1980. He put most of the 80s Topps set, I believe the last set to have 726 cards, in the same cigar box that he purchased to celebrate the birth of my sister. Now there's a custom nobody misses, handing out cigars to celebrate the birth of your child with its tiny little lungs. But he never finished getting all of the 1980 set, and from 1981 onwards, the only Topps cards I got were the ones I purchased or traded for on my own. I kept collecting Topps baseball cards all the way through 1990, at which point the collectible market imploded, though it's occasionally been brought back to life, although the cards that I have, including the ones my father collected for me, are probably worth more than my complete set of Target paperbacks. The 1980s top card set in particular fascinated me. I organized the cards not in numerical order but by team, and I handwrote on post-it notes the divisional standings for what were then the 4 main MLB divisions. There's now 6. In 1980, the Phillies of Mike Schmidt defeated the Kansas City Royals in the World Series. Although the 1980 cards came out in February or March, featuring photos taken in '79 and featuring stats only through the end of '79. So I really should have had the 1979 standings written out. In 1979, the Pittsburgh Pirates, Hannes Wagner's old team, had won the World Series over the Baltimore Orioles. The 1980 Topps card for Tim Foley, the Pirates shortstop, is a favorite of mine, as it mostly features Joel Youngblood of the Mets sliding into second base and upending Mr. Foley, who spent several years on the Mets, until April 1979, in fact, in a day game played at Shea Stadium. Then it was the 1980 Topps card set that I found myself sorting that March 1988 night when Time and the Rani aired for the first time on my PBS station and bored me to pieces. Bored me to pieces, to misquote Sylvester McCoy. Now the Topps company still exists, though in name only. MLB sold the exclusive baseball rights to baseball cards to a Florida-based hedge fund 3 years ago, and that hedge fund bought out Topps to keep making the cards for them. I believe Topps still has its office in New York City, but it is no longer a locally owned business. This is relevant to Doctor Who for 2 reasons. Number 1, Topps in the early 1960s got a license to print Beatles cards because their business agent spoke Yiddish, and so did Brian Epstein, and legend has it that's how the contract was negotiated. And secondly, I swear I did not know this until researching this essay this week, but in 2015, Topps actually had a license to print Doctor Who collectible cards. Now that factory set cost $150 on eBay, less than the T206 Hannes Wagner, but more than the 1983 Luis Aguayo. So now I know what to do the next time I find myself watching a less beloved Doctor Who episode. Buy a cigar box, throw out the cigars, buy the 2015 Topps Doctor Who cards, and while the episode plays on in the background, I will organize those cards with loving precision.
The Rani! Stay back!
This is idiotic. You'll injure yourself.
Why should you care? Since you were exiled from Gallifrey, you've had nothing but contempt for all other Time Lords.
My contempt started long before my exile.
And what do you want with me? And where's Mel?
She's perfectly safe, but how long she remains so depends on you.
You're up to something. Perhaps I'll find the answer on this.
You won't recognize the planet. It's Lacertia, and there's no evidence that it's ever been graced by your meddling presence.
You're trying to deflect me. So the answer is on here. That asteroid is composed of strange matter. What monstrous experiment are you dabbling in now?
I didn't go to the trouble of bringing you here just to discuss the ethics of my work.
Ethics? Don't be such a hypocrite. Your past is littered with the mutilated results of your unethical experiments.
I had all I could take of that Canton University days. Am I expected to abandon my research because of the side effects on inferior species? Are you prepared to abandon walking in case you squash an insect underfoot?
Stay away! Whatever you brought me here for, I'm having no part of it!
Leave him there!
He may be hurt.
Son, don't interfere.
I'll deal with you later. And that's the last time she will interfere.
Stay away, I'll smash this! Jack, I'll smash it to pieces!
Jack, get in here!
Time and the Rani is an absolute classic. I will not hear otherwise. It took the nation by storm. That would be like putting Doctor Who up against the biggest show right now, because it was up against Corrie, which was the biggest show on British television at the time, and Doctor Who still hit with 5 million viewers per episode. It made a dent in Corrie's ratings. So I definitely argue against numbers. So there's so much Doctor Who out there, so many genres, and this is very camp, very silly, very funny. It's not really taking itself seriously, and there's definitely an audience for that out there. There absolutely is. I am one of those people. Now, with Time and the Rani, this is a spectacularly frightening glance into the world of Doctor Who as show run by Pip and Jane Baker, because Andrew Cartmel pretty much disowned this story. He said, I didn't script edit this. They just wrote this. So this is the template of what a Pip and Jane Doctor Who universe would look like. And boy, do I want more. I wish there had been more. I am going to go on a limb and say to you that I think that Andrew Cartmel was an inconsistent script editor, and I think he could encourage decent characterization and great set pieces. But I think when it came down to plotting, he was staggeringly inept, and pretty much every single story he script edited, it just falls apart. When you start poking at it, it falls apart. And they're not helped by the fact that those McCoy stories are edited to hell. So even when there might be decent script editing, sometimes explanations are taken out, sometimes location hopping's all over the place. They're a bit all over the place. Time and the Rani is a beautifully plotted story by two people who know how to plot. So I would suggest that, maybe not in terms of dialogue, but Pip and Jane Baker would be a good backbone for this era in terms of plotting a story. So there's a mystery at the heart of this story, which is what is this experiment that the Rani's doing? What is behind that door that she keeps hiding? And we keep coming back to that mystery all the time throughout the story. And all the elements that are introduced, the geniuses, the Doctor, and there's a fantastic reason given as to why the Doctor is brought here, because he has a unique understanding of time travel, and who's got more experience of time travel than the Doctor? The equipment that they're putting together, and then finally the brain that's revealed. All of those things come together, and the planet, and she's going to turn the planet into a massive time manipulator and try and rewrite the timeline. It sings as a plot. It all comes together like a beautiful jigsaw in episode 4. And even more perfectly, and it's one of the best examples of like poetic justice in Doctor Who. The thing that brings down the Rani's whole plan is the very thing she used to enslave this population, and that is those bangles that are around everybody. It's just, in terms of a story on the page, it's really well done. Talking about Albert Einstein, he's there, and they choose him because he's someone that everybody knows. He's there to show this as a high stakes story. There's the geniuses of the universe at risk, and then that ups even further by the end of the episode, because the entire timeline of history is at risk. In terms of high stakes, Time and the Rani's up there. Like, the universe is in trouble in this story if she's not stopped. But I don't think it's an issue that this story doesn't delve into the backstory of Albert Einstein. That story could be told, but that's not this story, and that's not what they're trying to achieve. I absolutely think there is 4 episodes worth of material here. I think they do some lovely things along the way. There's a few moments maybe that could be taken out, like the bit where they're swapping mail for the equipment and things like that. But in terms of like the suspense of the story being built up, the momentum being built up, and the information you need for the plot to come together, that's done at quite a nice pace throughout the story. Like, the first episode itself really isn't buying into that. It's mostly about the Doctor and his amnesia and Kate O'Mara dressed up as Bonnie Langford, and may I say, I think that some of those scenes that is like the ripest comedy in Doctor Who you're ever going to find. It is two actors with sublime chemistry being given the most insane dialogue you've ever heard. Now, like I said, this might not be for you. Maybe you would go to a British panto and think, well, what is this? This is crass and obvious humour. But there's a huge market for panto, especially in England. So I can see why 5 million people stuck with this story. And boy, is it funny. The bit in the TARDIS where it's like, a little portentous, don't you think, Mel? And she just basically looks at the camera and goes, pretentious is the word. The funniest exchange, I think, is when the Doctor goes, why was the Rani dressed like you, Mel? And she just goes, oh, perhaps she's fashion conscious. The dialogue is really funny, and it's being delivered well. Look what happens when you go serious from the start. Look what happened with Colin Baker. They tried to do a dramatic episode where he murdered his companion. I'd much rather see the Doctor having some fun and the show having some fun. And what happens in this story is, yeah, he's a total clown in the first episode. And there's moments where you've got your hand in front of your eyes going, oh, what's he doing, tripping all over the set? By the end of the story, he's in command. He brings down the Rani, he saves the universe, he gets the geniuses back where the Doctor has emerged. He's gone from clown to hero in the space of 4 episodes. And I think he's very commanding in episode 4, and immediately in Paradise Towers, he is owning the show. What you've got to remember is we've just had 3 years of an uncompromising, violent Doctor that some people bought into, but I say more people didn't. And the contrast here is that he is cute and funny and a bit silly. And I think that's worth doing. Like, you wouldn't want another Colin Baker as the 7th Doctor. And maybe they pushed the panto a little bit too much in episode 1. I'll go with that. But it's still very, very funny, I think. And do you know what? I think Kate O'Mara is the one actress who is absolutely convinced that this is a comedy. And she's playing it to the hill as a comedy. She's the one that's having the most fun with this story. But, like, if you're not buying into the comedy in this story, then surely you think a lot of it's inappropriate. I do think Wanda Ventham and Donald Pickering and Mark Greenstreet actually are all really good in this. I don't think there's anything wrong with having scenes that are dramatic and scenes that are funny. Like, if you ever watched Buffy, it literally lurches between genres every single episode. Huge confidence, because Kate O'Mara in this is just sublime. I think, yes, there's an element of winking at the audience a lot in this. And there are scenes where Sylvester McCoy plays spoons on her chest. It's high comedy. It's blissful high comedy. With just some brilliant high stakes at the end as well. Like that's very Pirate Planet. Pirate Planet is very high comedy. Like, there's a lot of jokes in that, and it's played stratospherically. And then in the last episode, oh my God, the Earth is going to be swallowed up by the Pirate Planet. You know, so it's not like this is fresh for Doctor Who, and it hasn't tried this before. City of Death's the same thing. Yes, I am putting City of Death and Time in the Rani on the same level. Deal with it. So I have prepared some dialogue for you, which I am going to quote now, which is every bit as glorious as dialogue from the Pirate Planet and City of Death. Blessed are the pie makers, for they shall make light pastry. No, wait. Every dogma has its day. That's a terrific line, and don't tell me otherwise. Why are you behaving so uppity? Could you think yourself superior to me? How can I possibly think that, Doctor? I mean, this stuff is just gold. There's not a spark of decency in her. I'm overwhelmed. You are. Such superior diagnostic talents. Okay, it's not as clever, but it's so funny. It's knowing. It is very knowing. And Douglas Adams is very knowing as well. A hologram! As substantial as the Rani scruples. No, I haven't really, but I will find a way to use that in my life. So a guest on my podcast recently came on, and said that there's like a celebration these days about not enjoying Doctor Who, and people getting behind people that aren't enjoying Doctor Who. Yeah, like with a story like Time and the Rani, it's not perfect. Okay, I'm a little bit tongue in cheek by suggesting it's an all-time classic. Yeah, but I think I'm winning at life by enjoying it and going with it and laughing with it and having fun with it, you know? Like all these people that will just rip it to shreds, but they'll watch it anyway. Even though they hate it, they'll watch it anyway and like agonize over how terrible they think it is. I think every Doctor Who story has far more worth than a lot of people will say. Some people will write off whole stories. Some people will write off whole seasons. Some people will write off whole eras. Like an entire era of Doctor Who saying it's worthless and there's nothing of merit in it. Like, have you ever seen a TV production where there's nothing of merit in it whatsoever? What absolute nonsense. And when it comes to the Time of the Rani, okay, so let me just list a few things, okay? You've got terrific production value in this story. There's great location work. There's some very inventive direction. So he's up on in this quarry, filming from high angles, and it's like a vast vista that he uses sometimes. The special effects, the bubble traps are incredible, which leads to a fantastic cliffhanger. In fact, all three of the cliffhangers, the bubble trap, you've got the Doctor amongst the tape traps, which is really scary when you see them all hanging in the dark. And I always imagine, like, yeah, have you ever been into a bat enclosure in a zoo? And it's all dank and it stinks. I just imagine in there, because there's blood being pumped in there as well. It's a creepy idea, probably for kids rather than for adults. Oh, now, Kev McCulloch's score. Okay, so many people go after Kev McCulloch, and I feel like there are stories where that's relevant. This is his first story, and there's just no other score like this. It's like techno madness. It's mad, bad, and proud. It's doing 100 things at once. It's got bits of horror. It's got bits of like weird African American influences. It's mental, but the story's mental, so it's perfect. It has a unique flavor to it because of the music. So I think that's another massive strength, because it does make this unique. And I've never ever experienced anything quite as trippy as the Tetrap's POV. My God, it's all spinning lenses at the same time. It's zooming in and out with a weird orange kind of lens over it too. Some of the direction is really strong in this. And I'm telling you now, in 1987, there was nothing else on TV like this. Would you mind if I sung for a second? It's singing aloud on this podcast. One of my favourite bits of music in Doctor Who is that dun 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 dun, when all the tetraps are coming out, and they look amazing. There's about like 10 costumes. Regardless of whatever was happening with the show at the time, they threw every single resource at this story that they could. You know, they found a great location. The sets are big and very impressive. I'm not sure about the Centre of Leisure. That's an interesting one. But like, you know where the brain is, and there's that gantry, and that goes straight into where all the equipment is. That's a big old set for a BBC studio. The music's very strong. The direction's very strong. The special effects are very strong. The opening title sequence, CGI really wasn't done at the time. And I know it's dated. Of course it's dated. But it was like pioneering effects work at the time. And I'd also like to make a point about Sylvester McCoy and Bonnie Langford. I've always said I prefer Bonnie Langford with Colin Baker, and I do think that's the better combination. Like, she is so cheerful. She bursts that pompous bubble of his. And, if you've ever listened to any of their audios together, they just sing on audio. But I've come to really appreciate McCoy and Langford in latter years, and the sequence where they meet in this, and it's the most so if you're not into the panto element, you're going to hate it, because he's picking her up, grabbing what he thinks is a wig, and they're falling about the set together. I think it's blissfully funny, but it has this wonderful emotional punchline where he grabs her hands and just goes, Mel, and looks at her kind of longingly. It's gorgeous, and throughout this season, they do have some moments that are very nice. I'm not going to suggest that, this in any way is going to topple the McCoy-Sophie Aldred chemistry, which clearly was given a lot more time and development, and I think they just naturally had very good chemistry anyway. But I think there's more worth here. We've just had we've had Tegan, Turlough, Perry, yeah? 3 kind of cynical, miserable companions that don't want to be there. Suddenly Bonnie's on board, and it's sparkling effervescence. Ooh, the pool at top of Paradise Towers, all the way. And she's paired with a very sweet, lovely doctor, certainly for most of season 24. That's really nice. Why not have a season of that? Of 2 people that just want to be together, have fun, go on adventures. Like, we don't do it for long. Ace comes along, we're into emotional drama states and character arcs and all of this. But for just this one season, it's super nice. And this is where it all starts. And watching them sort of feel their way in together, I think it's lovely. She's the one looking for the doctor. She's the one that, gets that banged off. She actually uses her computer skills for once to make a circuit. So, in Paradise Towers, she's trying to get to the pool. She's got her own companion. In Delta and the Bannermen, she's lying to Gavrok and saying that the people died on the bus. In Dragonfire, she's with Ace and she's going to go off and find the dragon on her own. Like, take the screaming away, and the scriptwriters say they didn't. I think that was a JNT imposed thing. She's got this great scream, so we're going to have it at every bloody cliffhanger. She's a really confident companion. Like, I'd say more confident than Sarah Jane. I prefer Sarah Jane, of course. Elizabeth Sladen is gold. But Mel is doing more on her own, And it is weird, because at the end of the season, I think Mel's departure scene, whilst brief, it's kind of like sudden, it's really beautiful, and they have terrific chemistry in that scene, and it's like, ooh, something different could have happened this season, had they lent into that. Man, imagine Bonnie in Remembrance of the Daleks. The only thing that could possibly make it better. Well, I think Big Finish have proven that there was a lot more potential with Mel than was realised on screen. I don't think some of it was realised. It was mostly through the acting rather than scripts. But they've taken like a cardboard thin character and turned her into, I was about to say a book, but I was going to say a volume of books. They've really opened her out. Do you know what it is? That belongs on the stage. That would play out brilliantly on the stage. And I think a lot of this, you could probably tell Time and Rani on the stage. Like, there's big performances. It's mostly a few sets. And it is heightened performances. Whereas this is a TV production where we expect naturalism, and there's what's naturalistic about this? I mean, like, is there anything that anyone could literally sit down and go, yes, well, this reminds me of my life with all the lizard men and the giant brain and, taking over time. Like, this happens to me every day of the week. But it's also, like, I kind of like Doctor Who when it does go out there, because life is bloody mundane sometimes. The gruel of a 9 to 5 or a 9 till 7, as I do, it's sometimes nice to go somewhere a bit over the top and a bit silly and very imaginative and very funny, and just lose yourself in that. So I don't think there's anything wrong with going for that tone, going for like the comic junket. And I know I keep coming back to that, but I will emphasize again and again, this story is really fun. It's trying to be fun. And I think, and I'm not saying you're not a fun bloke and that you can't enjoy fun things, but I think there are a lot of Doctor Who fans out there that don't like it being fun or funny. They want it to be something to be taken seriously. They've invested their time in this show. Go read the New Adventures then, because honest to God, they love bloody massacres. If you want your companions tortured horribly, go, head over to the New Adventures. There's nothing wrong with the show being fun. I mean, you like Warriors of the Deep. I don't think there's much as fun about that.
Thank you for joining me on another episode of Doctor Who Literature. The executive producer is David Barsky. Each episode is produced by Jim Sangster and yours truly. This week's episode was written and edited by me. Our logo was designed, and our YouTube channel is run by Jim Sangster. Special thanks to my special guests, Jim Sangster in September 2024, and coming at you from out of the distant past of July 2021, Mr. Joe Ford. This podcast can be found on your podcast app of choice, with all past episodes at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/Doctor Who Lit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Blue Sky and YouTube at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and on email at drwholiterature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.